and welcome to a glorious and almost spring-like day here in the kitchen garden. So I'm going to use this improvement in the weather to finally get my grey shallots in the ground. So last year I grew the French grey shallot from some bulbs that I bought. I wasn't that happy with the bulbs that I got because they were such a mixed bag of sizes. Some really hefty bulbs that, to be honest, they're barely worth planting because they just produce a massive amount of silly sized bulbs. So anyway, I decided to save some bulbs of the right sort of size to my mind for planting this season. So the grey shallot, it doesn't keep quite so well, I think, as the other sorts of shallot, and as a consequence they really are best started out in the autumn. I didn't have a planting space available for them then, and they were saved bulbs, and I wasn't 100% sure how many of those would produce decent plants. So what I thought I'd do is start them off in some deep cell trays, and that's what I did. I just pushed them into the soil and they've done very nicely, and I'll show you the plants in a moment. So today's job is to prepare the ground and get those planted. So I'm planting them here in our border. This faces east, so it's down the western side of our garden here. It's not a bad spot, but the soil in our borders is rock hard, unfortunately. Despite tons of compost that goes on here, the soil has never really developed a nice light texture. Not entirely sure why. Our main veg beds are lovely and light, but we don't walk on those, and we've got that sort of soil which does tend to compact quite solid. So I need to do something about that today. Some weeks ago we went over this and we weeded it more or less, and then we covered it with a layer of compost, and that's been just sat there on the surface for a few weeks. Now I don't really want to dig this for two very good reasons. The first is I've got a heart condition, and digging this would be a really silly thing for me to do, so I'm not going to dig this, and I will probably ask my other half for a bit of help with this in a minute. But what I am going to do is loosen the soil just a little bit without turning it over. And that's the other point, that turning soil over is often not the best thing to do for the soil. So you disturb the whole structure of the soil and the organisms in it. So wherever possible, the, let's say, no dig approach is actually very kind on your soil. It's the natural way to do it. Leaf litter and organic matter and droppings and so on, that all falls on the top of the soil. In nature it's never dug in, not in the way we often do it in gardens. So it's fine never to turn your soil over, but in these borders it's just absolutely solid. And I think if I were fit and able, I would be tempted to cultivate this in the traditional way with at least turning over the top foot. What I would probably do is some trenching here. So I take out the top spit, get the fork into the base, loosen all of that up, and then turn that top spit over. But that's not something I really want to do. That is too much for me to manage, and it's not ideal for the soil. You certainly don't want to be mixing subsoil and topsoil. That is really not a good idea for the life in the soil. And it's the life in the soil that helps you grow good stuff. So let's take a look at the plants. Most of these are pretty good. There are one or two that I will probably reject, but the interesting thing here is that they have developed far fewer offsets than normal because I chose fairly small bulbs to keep. Not silly sizes, but we had lots of just too small to be bothered to use, but they are perfect for planting. So as I mentioned on some previous videos, with shallots, the large bulbs, they tend to divide into more offsets, and as a consequence they generally end up being pretty small. So you might think, oh, this is great, I've got great big fat bulbs, and you plant them out and you end up with these piddly little bulbs at the end of the season. So if you're looking for good sized bulbs, you really want to plant something that is of a more modest size, not so small that you only get 2 or 3 offsets, but I mean, these actually, a lot of these only have sort of 3, 4, some of them maybe 5, and that's ideal because the grey shallot bulbs, they're often a bit on the small side anyway, and they are a pain in the kitchen. The skin is so hard. Prepping small bulbs is a nightmare. So what I'd like to produce this year are plenty of good sized bulbs, and I think I might get that because these have produced relatively few offsets, and I think that's going to be ideal. Anyway, these are just sort of dropped in the top of the tray here. This is now full of root, and I will show you that when I start planting them out. I have lifted 1 or 2 of these from time to time to check on progress of the roots there, and they've probably been in a fit state to plant out for a few weeks, but I've been waiting for the weather to improve a little bit. But now is a good time for that. All I need to do is get this soil loosened up. So I'm not going to dig this properly, but I'm going to adopt a halfway house that should at least loosen this a little bit. So I'm just going in with the fork, giving it a good wiggle there. And I'm going to do this all over this bed. It's a lot less strenuous, which is good for my dodgy heart. I think it's probably a bit less bothersome for the soil as well, and I'm not turning the soil over, I'm not mixing up the layers in the soil. I'm trying to be sort of minimally invasive here whilst still achieving the goal of lightening this up a little bit, relieving a bit of the compaction. So if I just do this little patch here, should be, it's much better. I can start to get the fork in there. Yeah. Oh, that's not too bad. So now that is pretty good, unlike that. So this is really quite solid here. You have to work to get the fork right in there, but after loosening it that way, the fork will slip in a treat. So this is going to be a lot nicer for me to plant in, and of course it's going to allow those onions to get their roots down. I've got 4 of those cell trays. I started with 2 and then some weeks later planted up a second batch, and actually the second batch are looking better than the first. So I think I'll be able to fill quite a large patch here, and well, that would suit me because we do use a lot of the alliums. The only thing that I didn't think through was what I'm going to use for planting stock later in the year. So hopefully I still get enough small bulbs from this, but there's a chance that these will all be a little bit too big for planting next year. Maybe I should have kept back just a few of the larger ones to sow as seed stock, if you like, for next season. That was probably a slight mistake, but never mind. We'll have to see what happens. If I'm unlucky, they'll all be small. You can see here just how much this has raised the level of the soil just by loosening it a little bit. This is now quite pleasant. There's plenty of organic matter in here. I don't think we have any problem with fertility, but it's just too compact. Well, before I get too far with it, or I should say before my wife gets too far with it, I've recruited her for some manual labour. I want to get some of these planted in. I shall use this plank, no point loosening it up and then squashing it all back down again. And where's my other plank? There it is. Yes, the trusty plank I've got marked out at various spacings, 8 inch, 6 inch, 5.5, 4 1/4. I use this all over the place. I think, what do I think? I think because there aren't that many offsets, I could do these at about 6 inches. If I start there, yeah, I get 7 across. That's not bad at all. And of course, when you're setting these out in the ground, you would put them so that the tops are just peeking through the soil. When setting them out in trays, it's normal just to sort of just push them into the top, so you've got all of that cell there for roots. So what I need to do is drop these a little deeper than they are in here. Now let's just take a little look. Yeah, there's some nice roots there. It's not overly rammed, so this is probably a great time to be getting them in the ground. Just drop that in. Maybe I've gone a little too deep there. Yeah, that is it. Nothing more to it than that. I will be a little bit selective. I will keep a few as spares in case anything happens to one or two of these. Oh, there's more root in that one. Got more offsets here. This is a nicer plug actually. And just drop that in. These are a little on the dry side, even though I watered them very recently. It's been quite warm here actually the last few days. So I will give them a really good soaking when they're finally in the ground. I certainly wouldn't want to go any closer than this. I could put some in at 8 inches, and that's probably the normal sort of spacing I would use for big shallots, but there's so few offsets here, I think it'll be fine at 6. Maybe I need a new plank so I can mark it up at 7. that's the planting done. I've got 12 by 7 there, so 84 plants. I think that is plenty. I do have some spares, some of the more scraggly looking specimens, so I will pot those up to keep them in reasonable condition for some weeks more, and just in case one or two of these fail to establish here. I must say the roots were a little bit variable in those. There was one tray that was really fantastic and one that was really a bit rough, so I don't know why that would be. I was running out of decent compost at the end of last season, so maybe it's what I planted them in, but yeah, there was a surprising difference between the root systems. But anyway, hopefully these establish, and because there aren't too many offsets here, I'm hoping to get some bulbs that aren't such a pain in the kitchen. Right, so here's a tray of straggly fellas. This one has failed. Yeah, that's a rotten bulb. But there were very few of those. I think maybe only 2 that have failed completely. That looks pretty useless. I'm not going to bother potting that up. But these others, at least 3 of these, aren't too bad, so I will get those potted up. I've got some fairly big pots here for this job. Give them lots of room for their roots, so I can keep them in a reasonable state in here for quite a while. That's fine. It's pretty dry, this compost right now, so I have to give this a really good soaking. I'll firm it in a little bit round there, not too much. That will do. While we're on the subject of alliums, in a previous video I sowed a mystery onion. We're not entirely sure what it is, but it's some sort of perennial onion. I saved some seed because I don't have many of them, and well, I wasn't really expecting much at all. If anything, I thought there was a good chance that that seed would not be viable, but a few days later and I've got a tray full of this, and I've got a second tray as well, so I've got loads of this stuff. I'm going to have to prick some of this out, and what I might do is leave those in small clumps, and I'll find somewhere I can start a permanent patch of this stuff, or semi-permanent. I'll at least leave it in that place for a few years to get established before splitting and moving any of them. But yeah, that is remarkable. Be interesting to see what I get from this seed, but there is a lot of it. Anyway, that is all for this video. Thanks ever so much for watching, and bye for now.